Bett is the global meeting place for the education community. A trusted brand with more than 30 years of heritage, the Bett Series promotes the discovery of knowledge and technology to enhance lifelong learning.
This episode of the Edtech podcast is sponsored by FormAssembly, a leading web form builder and data collection platform for colleges and universities. With its drag-and-drop interface, robust integrations, and high standards of security and compliance, FormAssembly helps hundreds of customers in the higher education industry streamline data collection processes for students, staff, and alumni. For more information about FormAssembly, visit formassembly.com/edtech. This episode is also brought to you by TES, the Bett Global Wellbeing partner. TES are a global education business. They power schools and enable great teaching worldwide by creating intelligent online products and services to make the greatest difference in education. For more than 100 years, TES have worked and grown in partnership with teachers and schools to become a global community of 13 million educators. Their innovative digital tools, software and services are used by school leaders in over 25,000 schools in more than 100 countries. So turn to TES for staff management, pupil management, safeguarding and training, and together they'll help you succeed. Go to www.tes.com.
Resilience is not just you can't talk yourself into being resilient.
You have to sort of sleep, live, study and work all in the same room, and it's not healthy, I don't think.
And it's been pretty busy.
And I think what it's really, really important from an educational technology perspective is to understand what kind of well-being we are referring to.
Hi everyone, how are you all doing? At the time of recording this, it's a few days until we can go in each other's gardens, up to 6 people or 2 households. And so I'm really looking forward to hopefully seeing my nephew after many, many months, and also my brother and one of my very good friends. So some positives from the Edtech podcast. A big shout out to Bett for supporting this series, and FormAssembly and TES for supporting this episode, and to our fantastic guests. This episode is all about learner well-being, and we are covering how to define and measure well-being in the context of developing and using impactful edtech to support learner well-being and therefore learner success. This is all especially relevant given the impact of the pandemic, with over half of UK students surveyed by the National Union of Students saying their mental health has deteriorated or been affected negatively by COVID-19. And with only 20% of those students having sought mental health support. We explore the ambiguities in edtech, what's stressing students out and what's creating those systems of support, as well as looking into how educational settings can weave more social-emotional learning metrics into the usual approach of academic success. To kick off this episode, I asked Santiago Diosono Garcia, a former research associate at UCL and current research and evaluation lead at Kooth, about what research into wellbeing was useful to consider for those developing edtech or using it. Kooth is an online emotional wellbeing and research platform.
Yeah, I guess the answer is not as simple as it looks like. There is obviously a lot of people in the space trying to build, let's say, positive interventions or positive computing interventions, from chatbots to more like curriculum-based that has some psychological input, or obviously social emotional learning studies that look at this specific component. But I guess that one of the main problems edtech developers and researchers will find is about how difficult this well-being construct or concept is for people, and it's been for research to unlock and to understand the meaning of well-being. It's been a problem of the research community for quite a long time. So we know we know that well-being is complex. It's interrelated with other things, and it may actually mean different things to different people, and that complicates how we can work with this well-being construct in a digital platform, for instance. One thing that may be surprising, but no, but is a curiosity about well-being, is that it's so loose in terms of how concrete well-being can be that there's not even an agreement on how it should be spelled, which I think it already tells us that we're getting into an interesting construct to try to measure or to try to improve, because there's not even an agreement on the way we should write it down in paper. Some people say well-being without a hyphen, and some people say well-being should have an hyphen. There's also multiple definitions of well-being, and I think what it's really, really important from an educational technology perspective is to understand what kind of well-being we are referring to. So we know, for instance, that there are two main approaches to well-being, or two main perspectives. One is the hedonic approach to well-being, which basically thinks that everything is about avoiding pain and increasing pleasure, and it may be related with the concept of happiness to a certain extent. And then a bit more introspective approach, which is the eudaimonic approach. They are all Latin words that defines well-being in terms of self-realization, taking perspectives of a person who may be fully functioning, and basically, realizing the human flourishing and the human potential. And then another type of differentiation that people do around well-being is internal or subjective well-being, which will be, the psychological well-being associated with one person characteristics and features, and the external objective well-being that is developed from an external perception of one's evaluation of human society. So, for instance, this could be, your conditions of residence, your educational access, your natural and social environment, your civil rights, safety, and things like that. So we need to kind of have a laser focus on what kind of well-being we're trying to refer to, what kind of approach we are taking to that well-being, and then start looking at how we can use it for our Edtech tool, how does it match our theory, and how it can be implemented inside of our platforms and our solutions. Definitely, there is a lot of systematic reviews on the topic of well-being. I think measurement is something that has been a focus on. So you have, for instance, a very interesting systematic review of 99 assessments of well-being for adults. It's done by Linton, Deeper, and Medina and Lara in 2016. You basically have a compendium of 99 instruments and their characteristics and what themes of well-being cover. They actually devise the themes on well-being in global well-being, mental well-being, social well-being, physical well-being, spiritual well-being, activities and functioning, and personal circumstances. So you have a very interesting breakdown of well-being and which instruments could be useful for your tool, for instance. Then there is another research. War on 2012 developed a set of recommendations of how to think about measuring well-being, because I guess all as edtech designers think on well-being as part of the design potentially. But then at some point, if we are claiming that our edtech tool or our edtech innovation is supposed to increase well-being, sooner or later, the people that are commissioning our tools, or either teachers or head leaders, may actually want to see some evidence around that. So I think it's really important to have some papers that can guide you about, how to think about measuring well-being. So War in 2012 developed a very good paper, and it looks at different angles of concepts that you may want to consider. So for instance, if you're having a psychological or physiological or social emphasis in your intervention, this is really important to consider, so that you are selecting tools and assessments that are actually covering this emphasis in this area. If you're building, for instance, a physical education training and your well-being is going to improve because of the physiological functioning and benefits of the exercise, it doesn't make much more sense that you pass on a questionnaire that looks at subjective well-being from the perspective of your psychological kind of like states and things like that.
Yeah.
Then other things to consider is the scope of measurement. So interventions may help immediately to increase the well-being of that person, or interventions may actually improve or intend to impact in a more long-term point of view of well-being. So when do we measure and how do we measure it? How granular we need to get into that measurement? It's extremely important to have the right type of evaluation for your intervention. So I'll give you an example of what I'm currently working on Uncouth. We are developing a single session measurement. And this single session measure is intended to see any change before and after one only chat session. So this is a very specific and immediate change in well-being. So we are looking at affective scales with positive and negative emotions to see if that change correlates with our tool, in order to later on validate it and become a clinical tool that not only being used in Couth, but also be used across other mental health services. And for this one, we needed to look at that kind of like very short time space. And actually, we had a hard time to find well-being measurements that are actually looking at the moment rather than, 3 weeks down the line when you administer the questionnaire, or maybe a month down the line. So sometimes you're going to find as an EdTech developer and an entrepreneur and innovator that the measure that you're trying to achieve may not exist yet in research. And that poses a challenge, because normally stakeholders and the people that buy wants to see the evidence, and that evidence tend to be asked to be from a standardized questionnaire or a questionnaire that is validated in the scientific community. And for this new context, this online context, not everything is being validated. And many researchers are taking the step of plugging in standardized questionnaires in a context that is digital and is new completely for the initial design that assessment or kind of like tool had. So it's important to validate it between contexts and see that it works in a similar fashion from the physical domain, or, just handing in those questionnaires in the classroom works very similar to when you hand those questionnaires in a digital environment, which in many cases will be, but not in all of the cases. So this is an interesting area to consider, I think. And then the other that may not simplify things is examining ambivalence. So people may feel good and bad at the same time. So when you are measuring well-being, what are you actually trying to measure? Because if you're trying to measure the psychological state of someone in that moment, people may have a bad day, but that doesn't mean that they are having a bad level of well-being or a bad quality of life.
One person who has been working on trying to crack the problem of well-being measurement and learner success is Tej Samani, founder at Performance Learning.
Plex has been servicing schools and parents for now close to 8 years. The first product that we launched, which was our assessments, which early identify the behavior, the perception, and the skills that currently are either a strength or an area a pupil needs to improve on. And since then, we've been building up on it.
I asked Tej how Performance Learning approaches emotional resilience and learning performance through their technology software, Plex.
We've been working very hard on our machine learning algorithm. As you know, with the work that I've been doing with IOE over the years and UCL and really the papers that I've started to publish in AI Ed and has been the latest sort of enhancement of the technology to not only identify the social, emotional, mental health, the metacognition, the self-regulatory, the learn-to-learn approach within the learner, but also be able to intervene and coach intelligently the learner through multiple short snippet pathways. So if we've identified, for example, that the learner is particularly tired, struggling with their sleep, Plex has now got a series of really fun, intuitive learning pathways to help them with their sleep, straight through to if Plex is highlighted in the initial assessment that there's some areas of retaining and recalling information that they're struggling with, that's now highlighted as being an area of focus. They can then use their micro learning pathways within Plex to train the learner in being able to deal with and sort of upskill themselves in the areas that the systems identify them needing help in. And then our mission over the last 6-7 years has been correlating that to direct uplifts in academic performance. So as you're familiar with, I've just been on this crusade now. So overall, it's been 10 years, but I've just been on this crusade now, if you could call it that, to really place the social, emotional, mental health, the metacognition of the learner at the forefront of their learning.
When we're talking about well-being, it's actually understanding what form of well-being we are trying to attain and how to measure improvements in that, which has been a tricky aspect of this, especially for those working on EdTech in this area. And I know that if we go right back to the beginning of you developing performance learning and sort of research with Oxford Brookes, you had this sort of systematic definition and, you refined sort of what forms of psychological and behavioural dimensions that you were addressing. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you go about defining well-being and how you go about measuring that as well.
Great question. So the definition that I went into the initial research of this not really having a core definition of what well-being is, other than the 5.5 years when I left school, competed as a professional tennis player, where well-being was very much based on the notion of mental toughness and getting to a point within yourself that you could physically, mentally handle demand and load. So I would, in the early stages, define well-being really two simple categories. One, can I meet the demands of what is in front of me? And can I recover after those demands have been either executed well or executed poorly? In other words, energy. And having had those two definitions from day one, what it enabled me to do is sort of systematically, as you've said, work backwards to say, well, what are the constructs of being able to manage, let's say, obviously, academia as an example, the demands of my subject. So in other words, how can some pupils who are displaying resilience outside of the classroom, it would show you hundreds of examples of pupils who come from, really challenging backgrounds, who are incredibly resilient because they're turning up to school in the first place, but academically are not performing to their capability and often get labeled as being not resilient enough. So context really here is the most important part. Mm-hmm. In terms of then being able to measure, the measurement of this came about 3 years after we actually had a defining framework of what we believe resilience to be, of what we believe then what well-being should be. And I broke it down into a further two categories here. And if we're generalizing here, Sophie, I call it intellect and emotion. And intellect, genuinely from our perspective, means, well, look, I've got some tasks. I've got to learn how to solve an area of a trapezium, or I've got to learn about Henry VIII, or I've got to learn about the steps of the carbon cycle. Do I have the skill intellectually to be able to take in that information, apply it, structure it, analyze it, retain it, recall it, sit an exam, display understanding, debate about it, answer questions about it? Right? All the usual day-to-day activities in a school. Then, do I then have the emotional capability to be able to cope with stress, strain, pressure? And again, even if you're going into stress and strain, we broke down the components that often we experience stress as individuals, but when stress turns into strain, that's when we get into trouble. That's when we start to burn out. So we broke that down even further and started to look at, during the early research phases, what are the changes in the body's autonomic nervous system? What are the changes in my prefrontal cortex activity? How am I entering into slightly more higher frequency brainwave frequencies when I'm experiencing stress in an exam? What are the fluctuations in my parasympathetic and sympathetic activity in my nervous system when I'm experiencing the stress? Because ultimately, it is a whole body approach to managing that. Now, in academia, that's not done. In the sporting context, that's like waking up and having breakfast. Every athlete will undergo a level of psychosomatic assessment. They will undergo a level of physical strain within their body. And then they'll have a plethora of psychologists coaching them. So having broken down the fact that, well, I know my ability to manage my time, my ability to retain and recall information, my ability to recover, sleep, which gives me energy to sustain all of it, and my ability to diffuse anxiety and stress and nerves, because they're inevitable, because I'm being tested all the time at school, are the bedrock, the pillars of what, if I can execute successfully, are in essence will turn me into an intellectually resilient learner and emotionally resilient learner. The measurement of that then came after defining those 4 areas, which I did with Brooks, with the university. The measurement of that then came through what was then a further 3.5 years worth of research with, and this is where we then started working with, our mutual friends at the IOE, where we wanted to create, and it really sprung off from Brooks, where I then wanted to create a set of questions through an assessment, because as you know, Sophie, schools don't measure this stuff, right? We judge performance based on past performance. Mm-hmm. My previous exam results. And to me, that's not a valid indicator. The most important person in all of this is the pupil. Why aren't we asking the pupil about how they felt? Why aren't we capturing that? So the measurement of this came when we were able to define a set of questions and responses that would intelligently assess these 4 pillars within a pupil. We now actually have 7 that we've identified, that we've added to the original 4. And I guess it's just been, it has been an iterative process to say, okay, we know we've defined the skill. So remember my earlier triad that I mentioned of behavior, skill, and perception? We'd identified the skill that the learner needed to have, right? So I need to be able to manage my time. I need to be able to retain information. Then it was a case of, how do I believe my ability is perception in my ability to execute the skill? And then that 3rd data point was created, which is perception, of which we look at 8 indicators of perception. So it's been an evolving process that we've been able to then create effectively the technology to be able to measure and track over a term, and then ultimately correlate to improvements in exam results and test scores.
Tej talked about putting students at the heart of their own well-being. One student vocalising the learner experience of well-being to try and improve services is Charlie James, a student at Southampton University, an award-winning learning technologist with a background in further education. Her university course started in 2020, a year where things were quite different to what she was expecting, and she has since taken on representative roles in the Students' Union to mediate the student experience and try to improve support. Part of this includes working as an admin on the University of Southampton Discord server, which has over 1,200 members. For those who don't know, Discord is a voice, video and text communication service used by over 100 million people to hang out and talk with their friends and communities. Here she talks candidly about her experience at university, why she's trying to improve support services and the student experience, and what she wants from university leaders to make things better.
I've been looking after a Discord server since last May, I think, but I've been proper active on it since maybe July, August, and we have over 1,300 students on it, and they're not happy. And I'm trying my best to help everyone, but I just feel like we need our representation to be helping us, and I kind of want to go in and make sure that's happening. I think the best thing that universities and colleges and schools can do is actually ask the students who are experiencing the mental health worries, because at my university, we have buddy schemes, we have a waiting list for counselling, we have self-help resources, but students are still at home in their halls, alone, worried, depressed don't want to reach out. Like, I can't give here's the answer to all of your problems. That can only come from the student, because each student has their own independent way of managing their mental health. And 9 times out of 10, all they need is just someone to listen to them, just to sort of vent it all out and just say, okay, here are my worries. How, like, can you help us deal with them? Because most first years, I'm very lucky as I'm an older student, but they're 18 and they've been put in a situation where they can't get back to their parents, they can't get home. This might be the longest time they've spent away from their family, and it's just being ignored and pushed aside, and I just don't feel like that's the best way to go about it. I would like to talk about mental health in students, because I think despite all of these platforms for communications and being able to talk to your lecturer, I feel like students, we still feel very alone at university. And as a trigger warning, I am going to talk about the statistics and the current rates of suicide in students due to the pandemic and lack of mental health support for our young people. So suicide rates in students have rose by 56% in the last 10 years. And every week since the start of September to the end of December, at least one student has died. And that's 8 students in semester 1. We're now in semester 2. How many names and numbers is it going to be before the welfare of our students is taken seriously? Like, I went from being surrounded by my formal team, by so many students and teachers, to being alone in a bedroom wondering when the next time I could go home and see my mum would be, when the next time I could meet my friends. It's my best friend's birthday today and I haven't seen him in 4 months. It's not nice, especially where students are getting blamed for the pandemic. And all we want is someone to talk to. That's a lot of the reasons these things are being broken. 9 times out of 10, we're just lonely. We don't want to feel alone, and we don't want to be depressed in our rooms, especially our international students. All they want to do is go home. They're 18, they're alone in a country they didn't come from. They're far away from their family. Maybe for the first time, they're on a waiting list for counselling or having to sign up to antidepressants because they don't know how to handle the changes and the fact that there's just next to no support. I feel like it needs to be handled better. I know my university are only now just developing their digital strategy, and it's 2021. I feel like I want to say that it's better late than never, but if it wasn't late, then student engagement would be so much higher than it is now. But I don't blame the university completely. Obviously the government has had a big part to play in how things have played out, with the constant on and off of lockdowns, the restrictions that apply to most but not to some, the vague responses. HE students aren't even mentioned in some of the briefings. And obviously I don't blame teachers at all. It's not up to them to ensure they get the training they need. The university should have pushed digital development from March 2020 to make sure that staff, when all this started, were comfortable. And it shouldn't take me and my other students to be teaching our teachers how to use Teams and Blackboard when we started in September and they should have been learning from March. We need better, especially mental health support. We need clearer roadmaps that don't change every 5 minutes. We need support for international students. We need digital training for all of our teachers, so they don't have to feel embarrassed or frustrated or stressed or overworked or undervalued. Like, I feel like they're blamed a lot for what's going on. And at the end of the day, it's not the teacher's fault. They're just following instructions. Like, we're all just following instructions. And I really want to stress that we need to stop blaming the teachers. We need to stop blaming the students, and we need to put the procedures in place to stop students feeling like they have no other choice towards the rates I said earlier, and to put the training in place to develop our teachers and our students for the digital society that we're being pulled deeper and deeper into, and just being kind to each other, because at the end of the day, as long as you're kind, it can make a difference. Obviously, I was on a different end in FE, and it's been a while since I've been a student in FE. I didn't really need as much of the student support, but I feel like in FE, obviously it could be because there's like less staff and less students. There was just more of a relationship between the teachers or the lecturers and the students, so they were able to reach out. Like, for example, when I was in FE as a student, I had what is known as a RAP tutor, which is a retention and progression tutor. And she was constantly on my case if I wasn't coming in, or if I was like, she was always there. Whereas now I have a PAT, and that's a personal academic tutor. And I've recently learned it's not the same thing, but she just, it's difficult to communicate because it doesn't matter if you don't turn up to your lectures. It's on you. And I feel like I really don't want to insult any 18-year-olds because they are independent and they are adults, but sometimes you just need someone to check in on you. And I feel like we're not getting that as HE students. And I don't think when you go from having someone in FE, like in a college, constantly checking on you, to maybe going halfway across the world or even the country, and then there's no one around you, you can't go home, no one's checking in. I feel like it's definitely a shift that you're going to struggle with. I don't think students should be studying completely independently, especially at uni. I mean, especially with technology. I mean, I love technology and I really feel like it can enhance teaching and learning, but it can't replace that teacher aspect. It can't replace that group work, the peer-to-peer support. There's just so much there that it can't replace. So I wouldn't want it to be independent. One of my manifesto points that I want to do as VP at Education Democracy is to give that sort of role to the PAT so they're able to support the students. But we do have You Make Change portals and stuff like that where they can upvote, but a lot of students don't see anything from it, so they just
don't do it.
Don't do it.
One organisation trying to battle this sense of isolation to better connect students with support through community building and peer-to-peer is Together All, a 24/7 safe online community for people who are stressed, anxious or feeling low, with self-guided courses and resources. I spoke to their CPO, Famir Lassan, about bridging the gap between formal counselling and day-to-day support.
It's been pretty busy because we're seeing more and more people using our platform, just trying to get the support that they need, either self-support or tapping into the power of community, which is really the foundation of all that we do. And we're seeing more people trying to share with peers and trying to get support from peers, which is a powerful thing in terms of trying to manage your mental health. So that's pretty much what we've observed in the last year as a business. That we offer a digital mental health support service. Now, it's not meant to replace traditional counseling. It's more complementary. But the slight difference with what we do is that the support provided to our members, so we call our users members, is peer-to-peer, which means we're connecting people with similar shared experiences and they can share in safe spaces. It's anonymous. But what makes this even more powerful is we're not just connecting people and leaving them to just chat without being supported. It's a platform that is moderated 24/7 by trained wall guides. And these are all professionals and they're there for a number of reasons. They're there to provide support if needed, but they're also there to help with risk management. So if for some reason one of our members seems to be at risk based on what they have shared on the platform, our wall guides step in to give the support that's needed in the moment. And in some cases, if there's need to escalate, then they would escalate just to make sure people are okay. It's anonymous, which means that it's a safer space to share. I mean, the thing that we know about mental health is, I think society as a whole has come a long way, because once upon a time, talking about mental health felt very taboo. That's changing right now. And I think more and more people are talking about it. So there's less stigma surrounding mental health. However, although more and more people are talking about it, more people are not necessarily sharing that they're dealing with mental health conditions because they still associate some stigma around it. Like it's very easy to go like, oh, I have a headache or I'm ill. But people don't feel very comfortable saying like, I'm dealing with a mental health condition. But the truth is like almost everyone, if you think about the fact that anxiety is a symptom of a mental health condition, and almost anyone can resonate with having anxiety at some point or feeling stressed. So generally on the platform, no one really knows who you are, so you can actually share very freely. And that means that we're seeing more and more people talking about the things that bothers them. At the same time, there's an element of being able to support people that are going through things. And the two things that does, for people that are sharing, it creates that sense of being heard and knowing that you're not alone. And then for those who are supporting, there's an element where there's a purpose behind what you're doing. So you're not just using the platform to solve a problem, but you're also helping other people. And that also helps to improve mental health. With students and learners, as you call them, we're seeing more and more university students like talking about what they're dealing with, asking for help. Some are offering help, and we're seeing connection on the platform. The education space is a growing sector for us. So we're getting more and more people using Together All. And I mean, I look on the platform and people talk about very topical things. For some students, it's about trying to balance the pressures of studies and exams with everything else going on around them. I haven't quite found the right analogy in terms of mental health, but I think about the different stages of grief, right? For some people, like you're in denial, and when you're in denial, you're doing things that would help you through that moment, and you get to acceptance. And with acceptance, like you're probably going like, okay, this is happening, what do I need to do? But it doesn't necessarily mean you're ready to share. You're just really trying to understand what's going on with you. You find similar cycles with people going through dealing with mental health conditions, where for some of them, they're just like, at this point, I'm not ready to share, but I will take in everything going on with me. Or some people might go, well, actually, I'm not really ready to engage with community, but I want to engage with resources. I guess the key thing is just recognizing that there is support. And in some cases, it could be self-support through resources and courses, or it could be peer support through tapping into the power of community. And also recognizing that sometimes around us, there are people, if we feel safe enough to talk to them, that we can lean on and just talk to them.
For all of this week's guests, whether working in schools or universities or colleges, the pandemic has shone a light on the need to reconsider the division between academic success and well-being. Is there room for a more integrated approach?
As you may imagine, a lot more emphasis now on the importance of the slightly broader terms such as resilience and mental toughness as being a way to now, how do we measure this? And if we look at the amount of time outside of the classroom, I'm quite, I'm not that convinced there's been that much lost learning, because I think especially the experience we've had with our schools, teachers have just been phenomenal. I mean, nothing really has shifted. They've worked that much, that even harder than what they were working, which is who thought that was possible in the first place. Head teachers and schools like we've certainly had the good fortune of being deployed into over the last 5 to 6 years have actually managed to keep up learning. So I'm not a big believer in the fact that has there really, unless we measure it, been that much lost learning. I think that's a discredit to schools and what they've done and how much they've just put in over the last 6 to 8 months. Interestingly, however, what we have had discussions about very recently, which have increased in consistency, is the notion of, look, we need to make sure when we're coming back to school that our pupils are feeling okay, that they're not feeling fearful, that they're not feeling anxious, that they're not feeling, because they have been out for so long and it has been an incredibly frightening year and a half for all of us. So the attention is now going to, from what we've seen, the need to be able to make sure that pupils feel emotionally safe being back into school, that they don't feel overwhelmed now being back into the classroom with just the whirlwind of the last year. So cognitively, they're able to maintain the levels that they achieved before this virtual bonanza kicked in. And as a result of that, we've been fortunate to support schools to be able to say, well, look, let's place a focus now on the areas such as like really helping them retain information, really helping them feel like they're not forgetting what they're learning, really helping them get back into managing their time into normal school days. And as a result of that, will reduce in the reduction of them feeling anxious and overwhelmed. So it's still the same approach. It's just, I personally, with the schools that we've been working with, they've been flat out. And the other point I want to make is, and we can't forget the teachers who forgive me, I'm bashing my hand on the desk as I'm saying this because it's just like the message I've been wanting to get across that we cannot turn a blind eye here to how our teachers are feeling around the world, not just here, because they've been on a treadmill anyway. They've now been on a treadmill on steroids over the last year and a half. So some of the conversations we're having with our schools say, look, let's really make sure that while we are looking after the health, the well-being of our pupils, ultimately, we really need to do the same for our teachers as well. So that's all now become at the forefront of the discussion now, along with the usual exam results and uncertainties around what's going to happen in summer. From our standpoint, we've really encouraged the early identification of these challenges as early as in year 6 and year 7. So there's definitely been a hunger and an appetite to really start to look at whole school approaches now to make sure everyone's ready and comfortable and ultimately gets through to the summer, because I think we all need that summer holiday this year, don't we?
I think this happens across Wales, but I would like to see much more psychological input in schools. I think school is a very safe environment by default. It's a societal environment, and it's an environment that should promote well-being and should promote all of the coping strategies that we know contribute to better well-being. So I'm talking about simple exercise, but I'm also talking about having the access to a counselor quickly and promptly, so you can discuss some of your concerns that you have in life as a young person. And also, I would like to see much more interest. Despite I think teachers do have this interest, and they do look at social emotional learning, and they look at that aspect of psychology. I would like to see this emphasis much more from a policy perspective and a government perspective, supporting the use of these innovations, helping and training these teachers to be more psychologically minded, or in the fact of they're not wanting to be that psychologically minded, having always that space that you can talk about your mental health, your well-being, what you're struggling with, what you're thriving with too, within the school system, as part almost part of the curriculum, if I'm honest.
Everyone is quite aware of what's going on in the world right now. Chances are there will be some consideration, or there would be some other options to help them manage what they're dealing with. So some of the things that people might struggle with would be the deadlines and their workload. And it's great that they're talking about it in the community, but also I would imagine that if they were sharing with, say, the professors or with their teachers, like, there's a lot going on, like, I would love some flexibility in terms of like my deadlines. I'm sure that there might be some flexibility from the side of the professor. And the reason why I say I suspect there will be flexibility is because this is not, in terms of everything that's making them anxious, it's not just limited to students, it's affecting everyone. But the key thing is to not suffer in silence.
Yeah.
For some people, when they think about well-being, they think about happiness. And I think it's slightly more than that. I think it's really about the quality of your life across multiple areas. I was listening to an article, podcast or so, where somebody was saying that it's the human ability to thrive in adversity. But I think it's slightly deeper than that, because we don't always go through adversity. So I'm quite happy with the quality of life across different areas. And I think that when I break it down to areas, it's just 3 areas where it's like the social, the physical, and the mental well-being. And for some people, they might throw in the spiritual well-being, where you're answering big questions like, what's my purpose? What's the meaning of life? Why am I here?
I find well-being in EdTech really fascinating because, on the one side, you've got some of those tools that you mentioned. So, you can anonymize support and have conversations where perhaps people would shy away from those things in sort of a face-to-face situation. And we've sort of seen over the lockdown that some students and some individuals have kind of flourished using remote learning and EdTech, where their well-being is perhaps better looked after in an individual sense. So I'm just thinking about some people who perhaps might have autism and find a sort of larger classroom environment more stressful. But then on the other hand, you've got stories of poorly designed EdTech experiences or learning experiences where it just doesn't serve how humans learn very well and can be very stressful as well. So it's a kind of very nuanced thing, isn't it? It's not straightforward, as you said, and that it can both support or aggravate people's well-being, it seems.
Absolutely. I think, it's a bit of what you say. Context is key. So we may have developed some EdTech resources that were actually designed to be cooperating in a classroom environment, or they assume that a classroom environment will be given. So therefore, we are losing many of the other aspects that are very difficult to capture sometimes in an intervention or in an EdTech product, about social interaction, about how we engage with the other person in a video conference environment. And I will give you some examples of my current work. I'm working at Kuth, and Kuth is a anonymous free service for mental health support young people. And for instance, we know that being anonymous is something that helps quite a lot to help disclose information that may be very difficult to disclose in another environment, or in an environment in which your teachers or your GPs and things like that know actually your identity, and you wouldn't like to cover things that maybe like you're not sure yet to share. So something like anonymity for well-being and mental health can play a massive role in the way that people disclose information and how we can work with that information in itself. So context is key, and the way that that we design that context inside of our educational technology product, it's very determined by the characteristics of that content. So I'm not surprised that many of the EdTech tools that may have been deployed during the pandemic have actually not have the impact and the effect in well-being that we intended. And then there's also difficulties about designing something that caters for all, isn't it? You were talking about neurodiverse populations, and some EdTech products may not be designed with these people in mind, not because they don't care about that population, but because that population is way more difficult to access, maybe more difficult to engage in co-designing protocols, and actually maybe missing at the very end. And that can cause quite a lot of distress if you have a diverse population in your classroom as a teacher, of course.
We've just started working in the prison services with young offenders. And they are some of the most resilient young people I've ever met, who have, either made some decisions that they're working through and whatnot, or have just been a product of just horrific environments that no one deserves to even be brought into. Yet they're some of the most resilient individuals I've ever met. The challenge they have isn't resilience. So often they get labeled as being not resilient enough to maintain mainstream success in academia, hence why they've been kicked out of so many schools and referral units and have ended up where they are. And I think we've totally mismanaged that. I think we've totally misdiagnosed that. I think we've totally misinterpreted that. It's not the case. What they have lacked is the intellectual ability and the skill, because they've never been taught it, to be able to succeed in mainstream school.
Yeah.
Now, if I haven't been taught that skill, and then I go home and I'm in a gangland territory in parts of the inner cities, or I'm prone to county lines, or I have come from a very troubled background, I need to feel important somehow. I need to somehow feel life's right for me. Now, if I can't get that in school, where am I going to get it? I'm then going to go onto the street. I'm then going to make decisions which are not right for me. So I think as a nation, what we need to do is really begin to look at the process from completely the opposite angle that we have been so far. Unfortunately, we've managed to now slowly, and look, I've long been doing this, just really taken us 4.5 years to get the first one on board, but we've fortunately been able to get the first Young Offenders Unit on board to be able to say, well, look, let's not take a slightly more wellness driven approach, holistic approach. Let's actually begin to upskill these young people in what they have missed in school, as the first point of intervention, to then be able to help them feel like when they have that piece of algebra in front of them, or when they have that piece of English in front of them, or science, that they can actually take in the information and remember it. And that's sort of something I've been sort of banging the drum about for years, saying unless we make that shift, we're still going to fall into this cycle of doom.
And if there is one area of agreement, it's the positive impact of sleep and how this affects well-being and in turn supports learning.
There are even times where it's the fundamental things that help you manage your situation. One thing that people talk about a lot is this whole concept of like taking care of your physical well-being, and we talk about exercise and how that's good. But one important thing that we don't really think about, and I think it's super helpful to everyone, including students, is the power of sleep. So it's giving yourself that space to like step back, take care of the physical, give yourself enough rest. And that helps you to really create the space to think about how you can get some help, who you should reach out to, and potentially come up with a plan that helps you through the situation.
The assessments themselves, so we tend to, we're now beginning to more refer to it as a diagnostic technology because it's adaptive. So the responses evolve and the questions evolve while the learner is completing the questions and the responses. It's taking in multiple factors, such as whether they've changed their mind, whether they've hesitated, whether they've given contradictory responses because they don't want to feel like they're going to be judged if they turn around and say, actually, I can't cope under pressure, I begin to panic. So the machine learning element over the years, with just the volume of data that we've been able to collect through this, has enabled us to create an intelligent, intuitive assessment diagnostic technology that ultimately is there to act as a coach. And I think the job of education technology now is not necessarily to make life easier for the learner, but to make life and to make learning more accessible. We don't want technology to solve the problem, because that's not the purpose here. The purpose here is to teach the student how to solve the problem for themselves. What we've been able to do with our technology is just be able to ask more prudent, better, more direct, subtle questions to help the learner identify through the ML what really is the either areas of strength that they want to build on, or the bottlenecks, if you could put it that way, that are preventing them from getting to the next level of their exam results or the next level of their engagement in class. Where we've looked at areas such as sleep is really trying to emphasize and portray to students and teachers and schools that ultimately, if I'm in year 11 and I'm sitting 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 exams, that my ability to retain that information, to process that information, to apply that information is in direct proportion to how much energy I have. So if we break that down even further, we've wanted to ask subtle questions about the sleeping habits, about what they do before they go to bed, just to really re-emphasize the fact that, look, if they're glued to their phones and on social media right the way up to when they hit the pillow, that these are habits that they need to change. Because ultimately what they're going to do is prevent the body's natural, miraculous phenomena that is sleep, Remember the earlier example I gave about the autonomic nervous system and the fluctuation between parasympathetic and sympathetic activity, and the whole wonder of the body's biological rhythm, that it just knows when we need to rest. And if we keep fighting that, which we do as a society in the Western world, we're so sleep deprived compared to the rest of the world because we consciously make an effort to fight it. So what we're trying to educate pupils to do through the initial diagnostics that we do is really place an emphasis in key exam years, especially around the importance of sleep. We go so far as to say, well, look, you've got this piece of math to learn. So when we actually deliver the blended curricula within Plex and the learning pathways, it will simultaneously work with the pupil to help them improve their sleep while helping them improve their ability to not panic in algebra and complex equations. So it's a side-by-side approach. So the learner can see just how important their well-being is. And to me, sleep is the ultimate indicator of wellness and well-being, because it's how our body regulates. Right? Our brains work often faster when we're asleep to when we're awake, because that's when we're organizing our information, when we're getting ready for the next day. So, and studies over the years have proven it's just very hard to execute on scale, that an additional 15 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes extra a night does increase performance, either at the top end or the bottom end in the morning.
That's all for this week. A huge thank you to our guests in this episode, to Bett for supporting this series and FormAssembly for supporting this episode along with TES, and to you for listening. For all the show notes, including resource and reading recommendations from our guests, it's the edtechpodcast.com. And this is our last episode in the What Matters in EdTech Series 2, so if you've enjoyed listening in, feel free to tweet us at podcastedtech and we'll share your messages. That's all for now. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.